Good to see all of you this morning. We're in Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15. We'll try to get those analog and digital clocks all synced up before next Sunday. Maybe it's funny, the one that runs the bell is digital. These two are analog, and you almost have to go downstairs and guess as to what these say once you get down there. So we'll try to get those a little closer to matching up. We had spring forward, and then I turned it off for the gospel meeting so it wouldn't ring in the middle of Mo's sermon, and then we're trying to put it all back together, so we'll get it right, hopefully, or at least closer to right in the next couple of weeks. A week and a half ago, we studied out of the book of Romans, and then our gospel meeting hit. Prior to that, you studied chapter 14 and Paul's effort to try to get folks to recognize that even when there are weak and strong within the same congregation of people, you've got to find a way to work through that. And you got to find a way to work with one another and be patient with one another and allow for the church to continue to be faithful and strong despite there might be some varying opinions about certain things that have to be addressed. He kind of continued that theme, at least for the first part of chapter 15, in reminding them of that importance of this collective work that they're doing together is more important than their individual opinions and thoughts about things. And so they needed to progress and continue to strive for those things. Then he begins really in the second half of chapter 15 and then predominantly the entire chapter of 16 to begin to kind of summarize and conclude his letter that he has been writing to them. And so we're kind of in some of those summation statements here at the end of chapter 15. We'll see more of that in chapter 16 as Paul kind of wraps up his efforts with them. And so we're going to pick up in about verse 20 of Romans chapter 15 as we continue our study together. Notice that this is kind of where we ended a week and a half ago. He said, "Yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation." And we talked a little bit at the end of our study Wednesday night about that Paul isn't condemning other apostles or other men who may have stayed more centrally located in one spot and did their work of preaching the gospel. He just simply said his goal, his purposes, what he had in mind was to not just lay foundation on top of somebody else's foundation. He wanted to go into areas where the gospel had not been reached yet. He wanted to go into locations where it had not been founded at times, where it needed some support and encouragement. Obviously, his secondary and third missionary journeys, we often call them, found him in new fields at times, but also, though, those second and third trips were about going back and doing what? With the churches he established the first time. Yeah, and encourage them and reestablish them and help them. So he's not opposed to going into locations where he's already been or where the gospel has already been heard. But the purpose of his work, the bulk of it, was to try to take the gospel into places that had not heard it yet. Within that conversation, somebody asked me about the folks here in Rome and how was it that potentially they received or had initially received the gospel, because Paul has not what? It had been there. Okay, to my knowledge, he hasn't been there. He tells them, "I'm hoping to get there," and he eventually will get there, just not the way he probably thought he would. But he eventually does get there. But then, how did the gospel reach there? And I referenced, and I could not in my mind come to the exact verse quick enough. But in Acts chapter 2 and verse 10. In verses 9 and 10, the writer Luke lists for us the various locations in which Jews had come from in order to honor the Feast of Pentecost, and they were the audience that Peter and the rest of the apostles had there in Acts chapter 2. And if you notice in verse 10, Rome is one of the locations that is listed as having people that had come from Rome that were audience members when Peter and the rest of the apostles preached that first gospel message. So it's highly likely that those members of the Lord's body in Rome, some of them very easily could have been part of the scattering that happens in Acts chapter 8 when they all return back to their homelands after having come to visit Jerusalem for the feast day. Then all of a sudden they're introduced to this message of Jesus. they respond. And if you recall, many of them stayed. Didn't intend to stay when they came. But once they heard the message of the gospel, they stayed longer than intended. That necessitated the what? The money needs, right? The need for help. That's why people started selling their properties and doing what they could to aid, because you all of a sudden had a number of people in a location where their livelihoods weren't based. But ultimately then the persecutions and challenges come. Saul of Tarsus is wreaking havoc on the church. Acts chapter 8, the scattering occurs, and most likely some of those folks that had come from Rome take the gospel back to Rome with them when they return. I think that's a plausible understanding of how, at least one way, the gospel may have gotten into Rome and had what appears to me to be a pretty successful effort. When you've got an audience of both Jew and Gentile, a mixture of an audience here that make up the congregation here at Rome, obviously there's been some benefit and some effect of the gospel. But Paul's purpose was to try to reach those kinds of locations that had limited access or no access at all to the gospel. But as it is written, verse 21, to whom he was not spoken of, they shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand. That was his desire and goal and purpose when he set out to begin to preach the gospel. And that led him then, and we talked about those things 2 Wednesdays ago, to make this statement in verse 22, for which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you. So Paul says, I'd love to come see you, but what's been the problem? Just very generically speaking. There's too many what? Well, have you ever been invited to 6 different things on the same night? What you got to do? You got to pick one. You got to pick one. And how many places are there that haven't heard the gospel? Even in Paul's day, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. And so Paul says, my opportunities, my purpose in preaching, my work and ministry of the gospel has been very focused on reaching into areas that the gospel has not been spoken of yet. And because that's so many, and because there's not necessarily a large number of men doing that, the work was really falling on the shoulders of the Apostle Paul. So he said, I've been really wanting to come see you, but the bulk of the work is just tremendous. And my opportunity to come to you just hasn't happened yet. But what's his hope? Verse 24. So his hope, verse 24, is to get to where? To Spain. And when I do that, I'm going to come and see you as well. Why do you think and maybe this isn't a worthwhile conversation. That's a strange way to preface something, isn't it? But why do you think it's important for maybe Paul to write it? It's obviously important because he wrote it within the letter. For him to kind of encourage them to realize, I'm going to come see you. They didn't know him, right? They had no personal connection with him in great detail. And he writes a pretty challenging letter. He writes a letter that challenges them to make improvements and challenges them to find better ways to get along with one another as Jew and Gentile. He reminds them that they're all sinners in need of forgiveness and the redemption found in Jesus Christ. And then if he just signed the letter, see ya, right? I don't know whether you are as receptive to his message. If it's basically, you need to think about these things and then disconnect. I think it encourages them to be more receptive to his message when he's telling them, I'm coming. I've been trying. It's not worked out yet. I have plans. I'm very confident it's going to happen. And ultimately, I'm going to get there.
Do you think it's also maybe justifies the Jews of his going to the Gentiles to preach?
Yeah, there's probably some connection there. I think there's probably connection too, Bob, to the idea here. Notice we didn't look at this phrase, but he said in verse 24, for I trust to see you in my journey. And to what? And to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company. What do you think he's saying? Yeah. I think he's there. He's basically saying, Paul, I'm hoping you can help me financially with this trip. I'm hoping to come see you, but I'm not just hoping to come see you. I'm hoping that you'll work with me in that effort. That you'll assist to be brought on my way thitherward by you. Meaning, I'm hoping you guys will help me out here in these travel plans and things that I have going. And a guy like Paul, at times he would stop and do what? Because it was his trade. I asked you too fast. He's a tent maker, right? Right? We forget some of those children's class moments as we grow up. But he was a tent maker, and at times he's willing to do that along the way. But for the most part, he's depending on churches, brethren, to get him from place to place to place to place as he's preaching the gospel. And he sells them in this letter. I'm hoping maybe you all could help me out as well in these travels. Go ahead, Jim.
You kind of tell them, don't be discouraged because I haven't come yet.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it too. I know I've sent you this letter, and I know you're wondering, well, where is he? He's been everywhere else, and I think he's trying to encourage them to realize I'm doing everything I can to get to you, and then kind of the subtle way of saying, and if you guys could help me out, I could probably get there quicker. If you all could bring me there in that effort.
Brian, I couldn't find it quick enough, but going back to what you were talking about as far as how the word got to Rome and pointing out in Acts chapter 18, when Paul meets with Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth, they actually were Roman citizens. Yeah. They had been cast out of Rome by Claudius.
Yeah.
Along with other Jews.
Well, other Jews, yeah. And his effort wasn't necessarily, it didn't matter whether they were converted Christian Jews or not. And so there has been connection to Rome. Other thoughts?
Do we know, in his journey exactly we didn't see, did he ever actually make it to Spain? I tried to look to see it, but I don't remember any mention of it.
Let me get back to you on that. I'm sure I'll have to go back and look. I'd have to go back and read. I didn't look at it from that angle, so I can't. Safer to just tell you I'll have to look at it than to try to guess. Unless somebody quickly knows an answer to that, if they can point to a moment in one of his journeys. I'm trying to think about the journey to Rome was interesting. It had him in shipwreck in some places and boarding vessels in port cities of different locations. And that's what I'm trying to think about in my mind, how many of those locations there were along that path. But I'd have to go back and look to check all those details again. What's he got to do first? According to verse 25. Before he can go to Spain or Rome or anywhere else for that matter. What's his foot? Okay, I'm going to Jerusalem. Why? Okay, so for it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. Let's take a few minutes since we've got some time because I don't really want to wrap this study up until technically next Sunday because then that'll end the quarter and teachers will switch and we'll start something new then when the new quarter starts. But so let's take a moment. Let's think about what's happening here. So go back first to Romans chapter 12, verse 13. And I'll walk you through a couple of texts together here. This purpose that Paul was mentioning. So if you go back, remember in part of his challenge to them, as being part of citizens in their relationship with God and relationship with Jesus, he talked to them about distributing to the necessity of saints, given to hospitality, and blessing those who persecute. And so this concept of helping the saints who are in need is not foreign. It's something that Paul expressed to those in Rome. It's something that those in Macedonia had experienced. And so it's an important theme for us to consider for a moment. I'm just going to run you quickly through a handful of texts. 2 Corinthians 9. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 13. And Paul wrote Corinth in his second letter, whilst by the experiment of this ministration they glorify God, for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all. And so he recognizes the importance of this willingness of them to give, particularly Gentile converts, and in some ways their obligation to those of the first fruits of the gospel, which were whom? The Jews, right? Paul said, I came to bring the gospel to the Jew first and also the Greek. And there seemingly is a sense of obligation because the Gentiles had been grafted in, had been allowed the mercies of God to become part of His family. They bore a sense of responsibility to help those Jewish communities back there in Jerusalem that were struggling. So you see Paul reference it in Romans 12. You see him write to Corinth concerning it. Run to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 18. He charges Timothy some things to teach and instruct, that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 16. But to do good and to communicate. Forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. Now let me run you back to the book of Acts for a minute. Acts chapter 19. Why my pen doesn't want to work very well today. Verse 21. After these things were ended, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia. Remember what he said to those in Rome? Where'd that money come from that he was trying to get to Jerusalem? Because the folks in Macedonia had put a collection together that they wanted to send to the poor folks in Jerusalem. Well, here's he talking. Paul purposed in the Spirit, and when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. Okay. He's writing Rome. This is the time period in which he's writing to Rome and telling them about the purposes and plans that he's involved in. And he speaks to this administering to the needy saints in the very same time period in which he's writing that letter to the church at Rome. One more text. Acts 24, verse 17. Finally, he what? Finally, he gets there. After all the planning, purposes, and receiving the funds from folks like and those in Macedonia, finally, verse 17, now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. So here's the point. This distributing to the necessity of the saints was an important aspect. So important to the Apostle Paul, who in the midst of being the apostle that was focusing on which group of people, Jew or Gentile, for the most part? Gentile, right? He was the apostle of the Gentile world. But in the midst of that, has he forgotten those Jewish Christians back there still in Jerusalem? No. He may have become the great apostle to the Gentile world, but he hasn't forgotten his brethren. He hasn't forgotten the connections that he has. And in fact, he's been very, very diligent to encourage these Gentile congregations of people to take from their bounty and send it. And it's so important to Paul that happened, that he's even willing to take time out of the work of going into places where the gospel had not been reached yet and taking these funds personally over into Jerusalem. That's how important it was to him. That he would take the time. And he would let them, right? He would say, you can choose somebody you trust to hand deliver this. You know, of course, they didn't live in the digital age we live in. Pretty easy for us nowadays to help anybody just about anywhere on the globe and do it all digitally. But they had to have somebody physically carry what it was that they were sending to help. And Paul was willing to be part of that entourage, that group of people. That's how important. Now here's what I wanted to share with you in relation to that. if it was an important thing for Paul in the very, we talk about being the first century church, right? We talk about doing the best we can to fit and form ourselves and fashion ourselves after the New Testament church and the pattern of it. Well, the early pattern of the New Testament church was a very deep concern about the saints who were in need and caring for them. And here's the point that I was thinking about as I was studying this. To help them from a congregational standpoint. Those congregations in Macedonia, the churches in these regions that Paul was going to, they were taking from what they had laid by in store as those instructions had been given. They had been taking from what they had laid by in store and gathered it and sent it over here to Jerusalem in order to help the needy saints. I'm trying to say things without sounding critical, but I want us to think about the fact that I'm not so sure we do as much as that as we should. And why I say that is because, and let me rephrase it. It's not that we don't help, because here's what happens. The need arises, and what do? We start walking around to each other and say, okay, you give me 10, and 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 you give me 20, and you give me 5, you give me 10, you give me 5, and you give me 10. And we collect it and we send it down out of our individual pockets. And for some needs, that's the way it has to be done. But let's appreciate the biblical pattern here. When there are needy saints in need, it is perfectly right and expected, and really, the initiation of the treasury was for that purpose. So that you don't have to walk around and go, I need 5 from you, and 10 from you, and 10 from you, and 5 from you. Right? When they established the treasury, that was its first intended purpose. We see other examples of how the treasury is used within Scripture after that fact. We see the support of gospel preaching. We see those things coming about within the narrative. But the initial reason why Paul said to have a collection was so that we can help the needy saints, and so that when I get there, there'll be no what? Gatherings that we read it all the time, right? When we're giving, we say, so there'll be no what Paul mean? He means so that when I arrive there, you've already been laying by in store. You're already ready. You're already ready to help the saints. You don't have to walk around the room and ask everybody to pull their wallets back out. You've already done that. Let's recognize that when it comes to the needy saints, I didn't want to turn this into a big debate or discussion about those. I know for certain within Scripture that the Bible repeatedly tells us that from the Lord's treasury we can and should be helping needy saints. And that's the truth. You can't get around it. It's everywhere, really, within the early history of the church. So let's be willing to do that. And not feel like every time that a need arises among the saints in particular, that we're always looking back to the very same people that have already laid by in store for that very purpose. I talked to a lady one time years ago, and she really kind of reminded me of some basic principles that I had maybe forgotten about. And that was kind of one of the things she said. She said, Brian, why do we have a treasury for? If every single time a need arises that is a perfectly legitimate need that could be filled by the Lord's church, why are we going right back out and reaching right back into the individuals? Why isn't the church, if it can, it's got the resources to do it, then why isn't the church first stepping up? And then if there's another need or a greater need, then let's challenge the congregation to work on that end as well. Food for thought. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm not saying we haven't done a good job. I'm just saying that I believe that at times that we have forgotten that there is a purpose for the Lord's treasury. And there are specific descriptions of how that treasury can be used within Scripture. And let's do that. And not always feel like every time a need arises, we're recreating a way to try to fulfill that need. We already have ways that are already ready to go. You know, we've been laying by in store as we've been prospered week after week after week after week, just so that we're prepared for an opportunity when the need arises.
Brian?
Yeah.
I'm sure there is situations like that, but there is also situations that arise that it's not the responsibility of the church,
Yeah.
it is the individual Christian's responsibility.
Yeah. And I don't challenge that at all. I believe that to be true. I'm simply focusing this morning on the fact that there are repeated examples within Scripture where it is the church's responsibility and opportunity, and that's all I'm focused on. Is let's do the things that the Bible does tell us that we ought to be doing when it comes to that.
Brian, can we use verse 26 then to back up giving to needy saints in other places, not just in
Yeah.
our congregation?
Yeah, and I think that's an important aspect too. It's obvious that they had a first day of the week collection as they had been taught to do, but their needs were already met. They lived in a place where needs were already met, so they took from that treasury and sent that at the hands of Paul. And then you have to add other texts. We know that it eventually ends up into the hands of the elderships in those locations, so that they can, because they're going to be the best to know where the real needs are. And so there's some pattern to how it happened, but in summation, yes, they sent from one congregation to help the needy saints of another congregation. And maybe I'm wrong about this, and maybe you can cite lots of examples for me to correct my thinking, but I don't know that we've done much of that at times. We've been good about helping. I'm not saying we didn't help, because I think what we did was we went around and asked each other to give, and we helped. Where we could have very quickly and easily, without another gathering, sent to help needy saints in another location. Biblical authoritative example of that happening.
And who do you send that to?
Well, I think the pattern was they sent it into the hands of the elders in those locations. They're going to, and I think that's practical. Not only is it authoritative and biblical, but it's practical. If you're talking about a generic situation, Paul didn't talk about Joe Smith that lived in Jerusalem had a need. He spoke of the needy saints in Jerusalem. And so they were sending from a group to a group. And how's the best way to distribute that once it arrives there? You've got to get it into the hands of the elders that know the congregation and know where the needs are. There are also examples in Scripture where churches sent directly to an individual, whether it be a preacher or Paul or somebody. And so maybe there's a specific need that might change that pattern some. But when it comes to group, went to the elders so that they could find where the real needs were in that
Over the
location.
years, we have sent, and I know this for a fact, to many, many different gospel preachers to help them in their performance of the work in certain areas. And I know at one time I was writing out checks for about 10 or 12 different preachers that we were sending to. And of course, these preachers were people we knew and knew what they were preaching, what they were doing, where they were at. You know, I think all that needs to be established so that you use the Lord's money wisely when you send it out.
Yeah.
You don't just throw it out there. You send it to, like you say, the elders, because they know the flock, they know who needs it in the area.
Yeah. If it's a benevolent issue.
Yeah.
Or investigate as best you can the individual preachers.
Exactly.
Yeah, because that doesn't always even work sometimes. Jeff thought, Jim?
Already answered it.
Yeah, I'll check that up. I'm going to write that down. I answered a pre-question. It's a good day for me. Any other thoughts about those things? I'm not trying to grandstand or thump the pulpit here. I'm just something I thought about when I was studying this. That I think there's something to be learned there. That he was highly focused on making sure that needy saints were cared for, So much so that he would leave the work of preaching long enough to go to Jerusalem to take care of this before he ever gets to Spain or Rome or any other place. And I thought that was a valuable lesson.
Can I ask a question?
Mhm.
Back when Katrina and you all took
Uh-huh.
trucks and
Uh-huh.
things that people would gather together.
Yeah.
Could the church have sent money to the elders there for the?
And we did, by the way.
That would have been a good thing.
And we did. I'm not saying, I don't know what, I was not, I had not moved back here yet, but I did that from Moundsville. But there were, and we accounted for that separately, just for the record. Funds and things that we received from individuals, we distributed to whomever, wherever. There were some churches that supplied funding that we acted as their Apostle Paul and delivered to the hands of elders down in those locations for them then to distribute to the needy saints among their flocks. So there were two kind of things that were happening in that same. I didn't even want to get into it. It was scary, to be honest with you. The overwhelming generosity that left the Ohio, West Virginia area and then kept picking up things. I mean, when you're renting more trucks as you go, because these are filled and there's people waiting at the next location wanting to fill another truck, and you're renting more trucks as you go. Anyway, it was more valuable than I even want to think about. Scary valuable, really, and the amount of dollar value of the things that we had in that convoy by the time we were done made me nervous. To be honest with you, we were given some warnings about where to go, where not to go, and places that could become dangerous for us if they knew that we had goods of value with us. So it was hard, but we did make some distinctions, and churches did send funds that we were able. It's hard though that way sometimes. You have to be careful. Well, that's not good. Talk to me later about it. There's some legalities and challenges to that if churches inform themselves a little bit about it ahead, they can help guys that are willing to be the bearers of their generosity. Because what was happening sometimes, people would write checks to you, even individuals write check to me. And if it's above a certain amount, I go to cash that at the bank, then they have to report that. I think it's over $5,000. They have to report that to the IRS. And now it looks like Brian Price got $5,000 and it didn't. It was so there's some there's some things that I learned a lot. I really did. I learned a lot on that trip, what to do and what not to do, and I'll share that with you in a more sensible time.
We kind of live in a bubble, I think, around. The location we're in. We don't witness a lot of this disaster, like she mentioned, and some of the other places too.
Yeah.
We don't realize.
Yeah.
We haven't seen.
Yeah. And the world Paul lived in was different. Not to say that there's not poverty today and challenges and famine and difficulty, but the world he lived in was different. But you're right, Jim. I think sometimes it's hard. The truth is, sometimes in our little part of the world, even with modern communication, what happens sometimes is by the time we learn of the need, it's already been met. And that I found that to be a lot. By the time the information trickles down to me and I'm able to ascertain what the need is and what avenues I can look to try to help, then I get word that, the need's already, which is a good thing, but it kind of leaves you feeling bad because you could have helped, but you just didn't know in a timely enough manner. Now, I don't know. They're used to, and when it comes to supporting preachers, I'm live. I'm trying. We'll be flooded, and that's okay, I guess. Probably get 632 letters this week. We don't get a lot of letters anymore. Once in a while, guys looking for support. They used to come probably back in the day weekly. You would see them. I haven't seen. I don't know. Maybe one request the entire time I've served as an elder in the last year and a half or so, however long it's been. And it's different, isn't it, Arnold? I mean, you remember back in the day, you would have to sort through lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of requests. I don't know whether well, I've got my theories as to why that is, but again, I won't take our Bible class time for that. Go ahead, Jim.
When he said ministering to the saints, that could also be spiritual, just not physical, right?
Well, it can. I think in this moment he's talking about the physical needs that he was helping with. It can have different definitions, but I think in this particular moment he's referencing this idea. Well, notice verse 27, if it please them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, Gentiles got the benefit of being grafted into the family of God and the opportunity to know salvation in Jesus. If they've been made partakers of spiritual things, then it's their duty. Then that they would ought to also minister and help in carnal things. And that's not sinful things. That means things of the earth, necessities in the physical life that the church and saints in Jerusalem had. When therefore I have performed this, and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain, and am sure that when I come unto you, I shall come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. Now, he had great confidence. How did he end up in Rome? As a what? As a prisoner, right? He ends up in Rome, and in a odd kind of examination of his statement here, I come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. Why was he a prisoner? Because he was preaching the gospel of Christ. It was the preaching of the gospel that eventually led him to get to Rome, but I don't know that it's what Paul had in mind here. In fact, what did some tell him before he ever got to Jerusalem? Don't go there. Was it Agabus, I believe is the name of the prophet that came and bound him up and said, listen, this is what's going to happen to you if you're going into Jerusalem, and tried to persuade him to do otherwise. But Paul said, no, I'm going. And he went and he became a prisoner. He learns of the plot against his life. He finds ways to appeal to Rome in order to avoid that, and ultimately he goes to Rome as a prisoner. And not only did he maybe not know the manner in which he was going to Rome as a prisoner, but the events and circumstances and challenges that would happen on that trip are tremendous. Because that's the scene, right, where he ends up, they try to throw everything overboard. He kept telling them where was the safety at. In the boat. Stay in the boat, stay in the boat, stay in the boat. If you stay in here, we'll be all right. And then that viper scene where he's bit and they try to make him a god, that all happens on that trip back to Rome. Lots of scenes as it relates to the Apostle Paul that happen as he travels to Rome as a prisoner. All right, Lord willing, we'll come back to this. We'll start to examine Wednesday night some of his summations. We'll spend some time, since we have a little bit of time, we'll maybe even spend some time trying to see if we can learn anything more about these individuals. So if you got a few minutes this week, between now and Wednesday, look at this, all these individuals he lists in chapter 16. See if we can learn anything more about them. And we'll spend some time with that maybe, Lord willing, on Wednesday.